Hello and welcome to the Spirit Vessel Conversation Series, Professionals, Perspectives, and Deathcare. My name is Jessica Wirtz. I'm the founder of Spirit Vessel, and we're so glad you're here with us today. The Professionals, Perspectives, and Deathcare series centered around conversations with professionals of all types in the deathcare and emotional wellness space. These conversations aim to help bring awareness, acceptance, and normalization to the death and grieving process. If you enjoy these conversations, please consider sharing them on your favorite social media platform, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter so that you'll be the first to know when a new conversation is released. With me today is my sister and Spirit Vessel co-founder, Amanda McClellan, and we are joined by our guest, Marie Goudreau.
Marie is a grief coach and end-of-life specialist who walks the path of healing with women who have suffered a profound loss. Marie specializes in creating brave spaces for women to be seen, heard, and witnessed in the fullness of their experience of loss. Marie's approach is based on the assumption that you are the expert of your own grief, and her work focuses on guiding you back home to yourself so that you can find meaning in your life in the after. Having lost her partner to cancer, her guidance and coaching comes from both education and personal experience, which allows her to deeply relate to her clients' experience of grief and loss. She's the founder of Empowered Through Grief, a coaching practice and community that provides a safe space for healing and post-traumatic growth for women grieving all types of loss. Jess and I actually met Marie well over a year ago when she partnered with us as an affiliate, and we have loved following her Instagram account, Empowered Through Grief, ever since. So Marie, thank you for being here today. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's just dive right in, because what we really want to know is who you are and your story of how you came into this work. So we'll just kick off there and yeah, let's talk about you. Where'd you come into this work?
So everything started for me in 2017 when I lost Andrea, who was my best friend, my life partner, just the love of my life. He was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer in what felt, kind of out of the blue. And he was given 3 to 6 months to live. And so my entire life obviously changed in that moment. And sometimes I look around my life now, almost 5 years later, and my life is so radically different from what it was before the diagnosis. But that's the experience that brought me into, grief work and death work, and just wanting to build my life around this idea of being of service to people like me who have gone through a really life-altering loss. And that's what brought me to the work that I do today. So it's really all about him.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, such deep, profound love there. Had you considered this type of work before losing him, or was this completely around, your story at the time? What were you doing before in your occupation? Just kind of curious where you led into this work at prior to your loss.
Yeah, so no, I never thought I would be doing this work in the world ever. It was not at all something that I was considering or I was into before I walked. Really, I became his primary caregiver. And so I really, I quit my job. So I've always worked in education. I always worked with youth. I was teaching entrepreneurship to high schoolers and college students here before his diagnosis. And from the moment he was diagnosed, I remember going back to work after the diagnosis, and I was like, I'm not meant to be here. I don't want to be doing this at the moment. I am meant to be by his side, and I'm meant to walk the journey between life and death with him. And so I stopped working, and I was just with him every step of the way. I became, did all the things that a caregiver does. So the chemo, the treatments, just became really his advocate. And I guess I saw myself as someone who was helping him facilitate the kind of death that he wanted to have. And so I really became like his partner in allowing him to die on his own terms, allowing him to live out, what little time he had. So he ended up living for 7 months after his diagnosis. And I really in my humble perspective, allowed him to live that out in the way he wanted to. So he died as he had lived, according to, in integrity with who he was. And so that is kind of the life experience that has really inspired me to continue working in the field of grief and death care afterwards.
Wow, just such a touching story. Thank you so much for just sharing more. And what a beautiful, beautiful relationship to offer that to your partner, and just really seeing that as your primary role at the time and being able to give that to him. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of came in more to your career after his death and where that went from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it wasn't even in my mind, after he died, it wasn't even a thing. I wasn't thinking about this work. I wasn't, it hadn't been, it wasn't even an idea in my head yet, but I was moving through my own grief, and he died. I was 32. So I was a young widow. There was very few resources where I live. So I live in Montreal, Canada. I couldn't find any resources for specific to young widowhood. The only person I could relate to in my life was my grandmother, but she was in her 90s and she had 60 years with her husband before he passed. So it was so different. And I felt so alone. I felt so isolated, and I felt different from all of my peers. And I felt very unsupported in my experience with grief, loss, death, caregiving, and the trauma that I also experienced through the caregiving. And so as I was just navigating my own grief, I started writing, at first anonymously on Instagram, just to try to figure myself out. And I was always a writer. I always loved to write, but I had put it aside in my life when, relationships, work, we had a baby. So I had put it aside. And so I reconnected with this old kind of passion of mine, which is writing. And I started to write about my experience with loss and grief and cancer and everything. And then I started just connecting with other young women who had also lost a partner to cancer so young, who were dealing with the same kind of challenges and hardships that I was. And just my Instagram community just bloomed and grew to, I was just writing for myself, and I was writing completely anonymously. Like, I had no intention behind anything that I was doing other than just figuring myself out and maybe connecting with one other person. And it took on a whole life of its own. And I discovered that my challenges were everyone else's challenges too. And then it's as I built these relationships and this community online that I realized, like, there's so much good work to be done in the grief community. There is so much need. There is a lack of grief specific support. The women I was connecting with online had a hard time sometimes they had a hard time finding a therapist. And then when they had a therapist, some of them had a hard time finding a therapist that was really experienced enough to be able to hold conversations and to support someone through, death, grief, the trauma that comes a lot of times with the things we have to do and the things we have to see in the caregiving journey. And so just getting support was really difficult. And that's when I started getting ideas of, like, what can I do to kind of just feel some of the need, with all the humility of the world. I don't pretend that I can fill all the needs, but I just wanted to make a difference. I kind of wanted to take this really hard and dark thing that I had been through and kind of weave some light into it for someone else. And so that's when I went back to school. I got a certification as a death doula. I did some coaching certifications. I got support in different areas. And then I started my coaching practice and offering just support, grief specific support to my community. And that's how it all unfolded. It was all very kind of organic, and it just happened.
That is just a beautiful story. I am so touched by the way that it was your own self-care and your own gifts that really brought you into the world of helping others go through these very specific times and moments and hardships. And there's always just this sense of, like, the more universal something is, the more personal it becomes. It's like we all go through these things in some capacity at some time in our life, and there just needs to be a holding place, a support system for it. And it seems like you've just really been able to be that hand in the dark for so many people who needed it, and there wasn't a space for it yet. So really incredible.
Thank you.
And also just the fact that you are, you went for your certifications, but you were already certified in your own right in this work. So tell us a little bit more about the courses that you offer and how you work with your clients one-on-one.
Yeah.
Or
So I did go for the certifications because, I think especially myself, like I always want to do things well. I wanted my business to be very ethical and very thoughtful. So you're right, like I went for all these certifications, but really what really helps me is my personal experience and really understanding what it's like to lose a life partner, what it's like to move through and lead yourself through profound grief, how it changes just who you are on a soul level. And so the work that I do is really, I think in our culture, in our society, there's so much, we're just not taught about how to be with suffering. And that's one of the things, and I couldn't put language around it at the time. I can now, but I felt very alone in my suffering. And I felt like even my therapist was trying to fix it, or he was trying to, give me these like mindset tricks or change your thoughts, and, all of these things to try to almost bypass the pain or fix it or heal it and get to the whatever the other side, right? And so my work goes against all of that because I don't really believe there is an other side to this. When you lose someone you cannot live without, you live with that pain and that loss and that grief forever. And so my work is more about entering the suffering of my clients with them, being able to be with it, teaching them how to tolerate that suffering maybe a little bit better, helping them notice how does the grief manifest in your life? What does it look like for you? What are the coping mechanisms that you go to unconsciously? What do you do that helps you, that hinders you? And just being with the complexity of all of this with the human in front of me, and then making sense of the experience together. And sometimes I feel like I do nothing because I'm like, I just create a space where you could just come and tell the truth and make sense of this huge thing with another human, with another heart present in the room. But there's so few spaces to do that, to be witnessed, to be seen, to speak your grief and to learn to be with it and tolerate it and then grow around it, when my clients are ready. And in some of my groups, what we move towards is rebuilding after partner loss. Like, what does that look like? And what does that mean for you? And how do we build a larger context for our life where it's meaningful enough to hold the pain of the grief, so that our lives feel worth living, even when our lives are difficult and painful and there's suffering involved. So my work is really around that, around being with, witnessing, processing the pain, and then when we're ready, rebuilding around it so that we can hold the grief maybe a little bit better.
So powerfully spoken, and such truth in that. And I agree, there just seems to be this lack of sense of listening and holding somebody in the space where they're at without trying to pull them out of it. And it seems very uncultured in our states and elsewhere. Here in Canada, I know. I feel like some cultures really have that built in, that holding space to be able to listen with complete presence and just understand how natural this place is of grief is, and you have to move through it instead of jumping over it. And really incredible, though, that you are clearly a very compassionate and empathetic person to walk into that space with others. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with ritual or ceremony, either or, in any capacity with your clients, and how that really helps your practice and helps them?
Yes, so I do work with ritual. And what that looks like is really individual to the human sitting in front of me. But I find, in early grief, the grief takes up so much space. It's right here all the time. And it's easier to express. Someone will say something and we'll just start crying, and I have so many clients who feel like in their early grief, they had to tell the cashier at the grocery store that their husband died, or they had to tell the bus driver that their mom just died, or it's like, I have to express it. It's there. It's so big. It's so present. It's taking all the space. But as we move through our grief and we kind of re-engage with the here and now more, and we, at first I feel like we might spend more time in the land of the dead in early grief. And then eventually there comes a time where you kind of step back into the land of the living and you rebuild around your grief. And then the grief is not as easily accessible sometimes. And so ritual really comes into play with my clients and even myself. It becomes even more important, I feel, as we move through our grief, because it's something that we can do. And I work with my clients around important dates, or I work a lot with what I call the season of grief, and every client, after they've gone through a whole calendar year, I ask them to kind of look back and understand what their season of grief looks like. And everyone has one, like it's like an affect calendar for our grief. And our grief will be more present in certain seasons or around certain dates or times of the year. And so it's around those really difficult and more griefy times that I think ritual is something that we can bring into our grief process. It gives us something to do, something we have control over. It gives us a way to express and connect with our grief as we move maybe further along through the years. It gives us a beautiful way to honor our person. And so, yeah, ritual is a big part of my own grief journey, and something I try to guide my clients around creating for themselves. Like, what feels meaningful to you in terms of how do you want to honor your person on the anniversary of their passing, or on their birthday, or on the wedding anniversary? What feels meaningful to you? How do you want that person to be remembered? Like, do you want to share that day with someone else? Do you want to just have that day to yourself? What do you want to do? Like, actually, what actions do you want to do? Do you want to go to the grave, or do you want to have a ceremony at home? And so it's as individual as the grieving person, and it's as individual as the relationship that we had and we still have with our person. And I also find, especially in my own life, I'm almost 5 years into my grief. So Andrea died in 2017. And I find that the rituals that I do every single year, even though they change every single year, they really allow me to kind of tap back into not just my grief, but into the imprint that he has left on me. It allows me to weave him into the fabric of my life. It allows me to put language around all that he's taught me, all that I am because he was and is, all the ways that he has shaped me through his life, his love, and yes, his death. And so, yeah, it's so big. Ritual is so big, and it does so much for so many people. And it's hard to also it's hard to define because it's so individual.
Absolutely. I love the way that you're able to help your clients map. That seems like such an intelligent way to look at rituals, like through the lens of, their history with their loss. And so creating these touchstones that really allow them to create very meaningful experiences with their grief, and really acknowledging that is just so powerful. I'm really curious as well, like, are there other types of daily rituals that you help your clients with, just as far as like maybe somatic practices or creative, or even affirmations or dance, just different things that kind of help get one through a day?
So I don't do somatic work, but I know that at some point in all of my clients' grief, they're going to have to move out of here and into their bodies. And, after, usually the clients that come to me, they're anywhere from early grief to the rebuilding stage. And then eventually they're going to outgrow their work with me, and they're going to go into different types of support where they get to tap into their grief, maybe without language. There comes a time where it's like, I've said everything I need to say. I've talked about like all the things over and over and over, yet my grief is still very much alive, but I feel like I have to express it differently. And that's the stage where usually I try to guide my clients toward another type of support or another practitioner to tap into their grief through their bodies, through movement. We also talk about a lot how to kind of express our grief creatively. And so again, that's so individual for each client, but I have clients that are so creative, and sometimes grief can bring that creativity out of us, or it can completely just shut it down. And so depending on who I'm working with, we try to tap into just how could you express your grief in other ways than with your words, maybe through art, through painting, through music, through dancing, through creating videos, through whatever that looks like for the person. And in terms of daily practices, one of the things I do with all of my clients is I have found that there comes a time in almost everyone's grief where they fear that rebuilding or just kind of re-engaging with the here and now means that they're leaving their person behind. And so the work I try to do with them is, how can we rebuild? How can we be fully here and now and create a life that feels worth living for you while bringing your person with you? And that's where those daily practices can come in. And whatever is meaningful for the person in front of me. Sometimes, you might know your person so well that what they would tell you, what advice they would give you as you're facing certain situations, or as you're, making shifts in your life. And so I try to tap into that. Like, what would your person tell you about this situation that you're facing, or this question that you have? And how can we continue to be shaped by them, by their advice, by their values? Like, how does the value that your person upheld in their own life, how do you live that out in your life? Or what is the imprint that they've left on you? Putting language around that, and then creating little practices every day, whether that's, writing to your loved one, or, I still leave voice notes to my husband, and I still email him when I have when something feels overwhelming, like I still email him, and whatever that looks like for the grieving person. But that continuing to nurture and cultivate a bond with our person can both really help us rebuild a life worth living, and also ease the fear that, if I cultivate joy, and if I feel okay in my life, then that means I've left my person behind. It's like, no, actually, you can do both. You can keep having a very strong bond with your person, and you can nurture that every single day in all of these different ways. And you can also rebuild a very full life for yourself, where you are reconnecting with joy and meaning. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Very fully, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
And I'm just, I'm like ready to laugh and cry with you at any moment. It's just the breadth of understanding and perspective that you're able to offer to yourself, your clients. And it's very apparent that this integrated perspective is just so holistic, and it's so helpful. And I really understand and believe there is this sense of like, everything that we've ever loved, it lives on within us, and there's no need. And like, that's the beauty of it. You carry it within you, that's the gorgeousness of an experience in life, is that it actually touched you and it imprinted you, and as everyone does. So beautiful. Wow. Well, I feel like we could continue having this conversation for days. I'm really curious where your work is going, what you're excited to be offering, or just something exciting that you see happening in the industry. And I can tell there's a lot behind your work right now, and there's so much need for it, and there's so many directions it could go. I'm just curious what you're excited about.
Yeah, so I love my work with grieving humans. And when I was doing my certification as a death doula, I learned things that blew my mind and that have planted little seeds. And I don't know, like, I'm going to say something here I've never said before anywhere else. And I don't know what this is going to look like in terms of my work in the future. But so I'm based in Canada. And in Canada, there's very few places where once your loved one passes away, it's very few places where you're allowed to have a home funeral and to spend time with your loved one at home, and where the family and friends and community of the deceased get to kind of put together the funeral or the memorial or the ceremony after their death. And I remember when I learned this, so if I'm not mistaken, where I live, I'm in the province of Quebec, I'm in Montreal. It's not legal here to have a home funeral. It is, I believe, in Ontario, but not here. And it is in a few US states and then not in others. And so that's something I definitely, if I don't help families facilitate that for themselves, or if I'm not involved in it in some way myself, I at least want to educate people that this is an option. Because when my husband died, we were very blessed, we were very lucky. He had a beautiful experience for the last week of his life where we were in a palliative care home that was not in a hospital. So it was a home, and it was beautiful, beautiful gardens, and the whole family got to be here, and we got to bring our animals, and like it was just like this beautiful holistic kind of place that could hold the experience of his death with all of us. And he passed, and his body was taken away like in a couple of hours, and I have lived through death by an illness. So I've had the time to be with him, have the conversations, talk about death. I, experience anticipatory grief. And then when in the work that I do with my grieving clients, so many of them have lost someone suddenly. And when someone dies suddenly, sometimes they don't even have the time to be with their loved one or to see their loved one again until the funeral, until they're cremated or until they're in the casket. And there is something so, I don't know what's the right word I want to use. It's like it goes against all of our instincts, that our person dies suddenly and we don't get to be with them. We don't get to hold their bodies. We don't get to slow down and take the time to absorb the news of what happened. And we don't get to bring our person home with us for a day, a couple of days, for a while. That we don't have the chance to, it's like death is it's taken away, it's medicalized. It's like our person dies and they get taken away from us. And I feel like there's something very unnatural and very, not for everyone, but it can even be traumatizing for some grievers to not have the time that they require to adjust to the reality that their person has just died, and to be able to be with them and to do whatever ritual or ceremony they feel called to do in that moment, And so I know for a fact that that's something I want to bring into my work, to at least educate people that this is a possibility in some places, and then maybe to advocate that this be a possibility everywhere, because I think that a lot of grieving people, especially with sudden loss, they struggle with the fact that they didn't get the time to say goodbye. They didn't get the time to be with their loved one in their last moments, and then they feel like just in the blink of an eye they're buried in the ground or they were cremated, and then it's like you're left to deal with the fallout without allowing your spirit, your soul, your body to catch up with what has just happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Just yes to all of that. And it is, from my perspective as well, just so unnatural that we would do that. And that's really only within like the last, little over 150 years. I mean, before that, we would sit with our dead and we would be able to understand and integrate what happened. And, I think of the animal kingdom, like the animals do this with their dead. They don't just pick up and walk away, like they stay, they watch over, they almost have vigil, it's like they're just with them. And that is part of the caretaking, emotionally and physically. Absolutely. Well, I think you're really onto something there, and something that a lot of people aren't educated about and definitely need. I know Amanda and I have really recognized the ceremony aspect of that, and just that place that can be a sacred holding container for families to really participate in what they're feeling and have their emotions come up and really be spoken to and understand, like, this is a completely normal process. The only thing that makes it unnormal is the fact that we've been told this for so long that we shouldn't be feeling it, and how to cover it up as quickly as you can and move past it. But
Mm.
well, that is absolutely a very great need for so many of us. So wherever you go with that, we're excited for you. And we're really excited to be able to have this conversation with you today, and just look forward to staying in touch in a lot of different ways.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So Marie, please share with us where everybody can find you.
Yes, so the easiest place to find me is where I'm at every day. Probably spend way too much time, but on my Instagram, in my Instagram community at empowered_through_grief. I am there every day. I still run the page all by myself. I answer every message from every grieving heart myself, or at least I try to. But it's the space where I share my thoughts, my own process, my perspectives, and I share my work with the world. And whether or not, we work together, just come and be a part of the conversation, because it's just, that's where my people are, and that's where I am most of the time. And then I have my website, empoweredthroughgrief.com, where I share my offerings and my support containers, my groups, and things like that. But Instagram is really where you can connect with me and just come and say hi, and I will answer.
Awesome. We love your Instagram account. We're always popping over there to see what new posts you've put up recently, and definitely everybody go hang out with Marie on Instagram. So as a reminder, if you enjoyed today's conversation, please share it on your favorite social media platform, whether it's Instagram or somewhere else, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter at spiritvessel.com/newsletter so that you'll be one of the first to know when a new conversation is released. Thank you again so much, Marie. It's been wonderful to have you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.